Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all of our attendees and our panelists today. Thank you all for making the time to attend today's Commonwealth Day workshop on Youthquakes and youth activism in the Commonwealth. This session will focus on three main themes: youth engagement with parliamentary processes and political action, the impacts of COVID-19 on youth activism, and the unique challenges currently facing young people in the Commonwealth. Before we hear from our panelists, I'd just like to go over a little bit of quick housekeeping. So this workshop will be recorded but not live streamed. So if you would like us to remove any aspects of the final recording, please just let us know. We're more than happy to take on any feedback regarding that. As this is a Zoom webinar, attendees are unable to turn on their cameras or unmute themselves. However, at the end of the session, once panelists have presented, we will have a Q&A session where we'll allow attendees to engage directly with the panelists. Should you have a question, please just write the question using the chat function or the Q&A function that should be present on your screen at that time as well. Should you wish, you can also wish to keep your questions anonymous when you write them into us in the chat feature. Please do feel free to chat with other attendees using the chat function as well. Peer-to-peer engagement is one of the biggest benefits of these webinars. Also, if you're experiencing any technical difficulties, you can't hear us or anything like that, then of course also use the chat feature to let us know of that. The CPA also believes in having a policy of mutual respect, so just something to keep in mind throughout that process. So with that, I think we're ready to move on to the opening remarks today that are going to be given by Latu Bloomfield, who is the Virtual Commonwealth Youth Parliament 2020 Prime Minister. So I will hand over to you, Latu, take it away.
Thank you very much, Ms. Wall. I just wanted to say, I think it'll be okay for me to just do the opening remarks, and I can add on with my presentation to any of the questions that the attendees may have, just because of time allocations, if that is okay.
Certainly.
Okay. So I shall start. I acknowledge the presence of the Almighty, Commonwealth members, parliamentary staff, and panelists, ladies and gentlemen. I'm deeply honored to welcome you all to this virtual Commonwealth Parliamentary Conference workshop titled Youthquakes and Rising Youth Activism in Commonwealth as part of the celebration of the Commonwealth Day. As the British rock band Queen once said, the show must go on. Therefore, I thank you all for being virtually present despite the different time zones and the restrictions of the global pandemic. COVID-19, a disease invisible to the naked eye, has seized a lot of opportunities and affected a lot of people's lives, including youth. However, with the presence of digital tools, young people have utilized it to their advantage, just how you and I are at this moment. Digital platforms has been used by youth and youth-focused organizations for different reasons, leading to youthquakes and youth activism. I applaud the Commonwealth Parliamentary Association for conducting the Virtual Commonwealth Youth Parliament 2020 and giving me the opportunity to participate in spite of the restrictions of COVID-19. That is an example of utilizing digital tools for positive impacts. Young people have become more confident in raising awareness and conducting social, cultural, and political movements on climate change, gender equality, and racial justice. Ever since the outbreak, we have all witnessed the decisions made by different governments for the well-being of their people. This has made young people more vigilant and aware of the importance of their civil duties and the necessity of choosing reliable leaders. The voices and needs of youth are very crucial for the development of any country, for they will not only be the leaders of tomorrow, but of today. Unfortunately, in some countries like Tonga, youths are not aware of the civil right or duty or the function of their government due to cultural upbringing, lack of awareness, and exposure. These are issues that draw up plans for initiatives led by political activists and organizations. Nevertheless, worldwide, only 31% of young people participate in these initiatives because of the pandemic, which affects the work and target of youth-focused organizations and young activists. As you may all know, there's a handful of issues that young people with or without the presence of COVID-19, which includes unemployment, mental health, family conflicts, financial insecurity, lack of political literacy, etc. Therefore, I urge all young activists and youth-focused organizations to never cease the good fight and keep looking for long-term and possible solutions, for we are the voice of a lot of young people in minority groups. Some of these issues may take a while to overcome entirely, but with daily determination and endurance, we are capable of constructing and implementing solutions for the betterment of young people. Once again, I take this opportunity to welcome you all to this vital workshop and hope that by the end of this session, we will learn and gain insight into the objectives from one another. Happy Commonwealth Day, and thank you very much.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that, Latu. There were some really interesting and great points made there. Definitely looks like we are moving forward in terms of youth engagement, and I'm really looking forward to what our other speakers will have to say about those topics as well. So next speaking, we have Elizabeth Kite, who is the Pacific Regional Representative for the Commonwealth Youth Council, which is the world's largest and most diverse youth group, which represents 1.2 billion young people who reside in the Commonwealth. She is the founder and president of Tonga's only youth-led NGO, Tonga Youth Leaders. She also received a Queen Young's Leaders Award in 2017, very well deserved. So I'll hand over now. The floor is yours, Elizabeth.
Still muted. Malapita, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. First, I'd like to say a very happy Commonwealth Day to everybody that's tuning in, and also a happy International Women's Day as well. It's my pleasure to be here. I generally keep these quite conversational. I think that's just how youth better engage. So I'm going to stick to the points that I was asked to speak on, and I'll just speak on that. And if you have any questions throughout, you're more than welcome to just like shoot them through, and I'll keep an eye out. But I wanted to talk specifically on what COVID's been like for us here in the Pacific region. I understand that it's been really difficult everywhere. It is a pandemic, so it is a global issue, but it has been very different, the experience in the Pacific, because most of us actually don't have the virus in our country, including Tonga, which is where I currently reside. But that's not to say that we don't have any of the other consequences that COVID has impacted other countries on, for example, with tourism, employment, and even mental health issues, which I think is quite an increasing issue that we're seeing among youth across the whole of not just the Pacific region, but the Commonwealth. But firstly, in terms of just how a lot of these countries on our end haven't got the virus, I think it's fair to give thanks and recognize the hard work that our governments and our Ministry of Health and Ministries of Emergencies and our frontliners have done in keeping the virus out of our countries, basically. They've been very swift in taking action because our country is here very small. And so it's a pretty big threat if the virus does come through with one person. It poses, it can be quite deadly for most of us. So the fact that a lot of our Pacific Islands haven't actually even gotten the virus yet is a really good thing. But yes, so some of the other effects though that I wanted to touch on, because it is different when I do talk to people from across the Commonwealth on what it's like here. I feel quite privileged in that we can walk around freely. We don't have to wear masks. We don't have to register in restaurants if we go there. We're quite free in just our everyday lives, which is quite great. But in terms of employment, we've seen that affected here in our region too. And in terms of, mental health is the other point that I wanted to highlight. This whole pandemic has really caused a lot of stress for a lot of us. And I work a lot with youth, and just the unknown of what COVID can bring for a lot of us is quite scary for everyone. And I think youth have really taken on the role of kind of showing how we can stand in solidarity despite not being so well connected in person, if that makes any sense. Right? So that's the first point. And the second point that I wanted to cover, which I was asked to speak on, was just how youth activism has been so there's been a lot of youth activism worldwide. And if this is ongoing in the Pacific as well. Yes, I think, oh, hello, Harry.
Hello.
Good to see you. Yes, so there has been great activism that we've seen continue within our Pacific region, despite what's going on worldwide. We've seen that through the CYC's work with some of their programs running in Tonga, example, which is She Leads Whalelea, which is She Leads Parliament, that's still pushing the to further female representation in the political arena. We've also seen the youth parliament for Commonwealth Youth Parliament still running, as you can see with Lathu is present here. So activism has still been going on, particularly in person in Australia and New Zealand. We've seen a lot of that happening, and some of those who have fought for some of these, who have joined some of these rallies, if you call it that, have been from the Pacific Islands. So it's a lot of our diaspora, and even some have been from our diaspora who are stuck in these other countries because they're unable to come back home. So we're seeing that. And in the Pacific as well, activism is done very differently because we operate quite differently because of our values. And so in terms of activism in Tonga, example, it's remained quite the same. We haven't stopped any of our work. We've been able to actually unite more with the government, for an example, because they really realized through COVID the importance of youth and young women and what they have to say in their decision making during this really difficult time. I think one of the greatest things about COVID is that it's really highlighted the importance and significance of marginalized voices and underrepresented voices, because they're the ones most affected. And if they're not being addressed and if they're not being helped, then that reflects very badly on our leaders. And so this was a really good wake-up call for our leaders to, an urge, to push them to really be swift in their action to look after these people in particular and start prioritizing them better. So while there have been, while this time is very difficult across the globe and in the Pacific region, I think there have been definitely benefits that we've all learned from and that we are still learning from. One of the examples I want to give from Tonga is how there's been a focus on healthier eating. And I think this is also reflected in Australia, New Zealand. I can see that happening there, of growing your own foods. That's a positive activity to start, and I think that's increasing, and we're starting to see healthier eating, which also affects the mind and whatnot. Anyway, I think I'm going to just end there, but I think I've explained enough about what it's like here in the Pacific region. It is different, but we are still facing some of the same challenges other countries are, if not the virus. And I think that's where we have to thank our governments, our ministries, our frontliners for that. But while that's, it's still been good in that sense, we do still face some hardship. And it's thanks to dialogues like this that we're able to come together and learn from each other and see and formulate solutions together. So thank you. I look forward to some of the questions that will come through later on in this dialogue.
Thanks so much for that, Elizabeth. It was really interesting to get an insight into Tonga's experience, as it's one of the few countries in the world, that doesn't have COVID-19 present. But obviously, we can still really see the effects. Also really interesting with Tonga as another food growing nation to see how that's, been a benefit to them and youth throughout. So thank you so much. Our next speaker is Harry Olikwallafa, with another impressive CV. He is the Vice Chair of the Solomon Islands National Youth Congress, the Vice Chair of the Pacific Youth Council, and the President, Honiara Youth Council. He is also the former Pacific Regional Representative of the Commonwealth Youth Council. So I will now hand over to Harry to deliver his presentation. It looks like you're still on mute there, Harry. Can you please unmute yourself?
Do you hear me now?
Yeah, we can hear you loud and clear now. Thanks so much, Harry. You go ahead.
Thank you. First of all, I would like to begin by say thank you to Commonwealth Parliamentary Association for providing this opportunity for us young people in the Commonwealth to share what are the challenges and also share recommendation with government so that they can, help young people facilitate their aspiration for better life. I would like to begin by give you a brief background of the Solomon Island population, the stats of Solomon Island youth population. So as you can read our national youth policy, Solomon Island is a youthful population, or is a youthful nation across a Pacific region. 70% of our population in Solomon Island in 2015, approximately 433,000 out of the estimated 633,000 people were under the age of 34, which is an alarming growing rate for Solomon Island. And also the projection by 2030, population of participants under the age of 30 would be projected an increase of 600,000, which equivalent to the rough estimation of our population in 2050 would be around 1.35 million people. 1.35 million people in Solomon Island, roughly the population projected by our census. So given the bulk population or the bulk youth population we have, I believe government of the day should tailor its policy towards a target population. And I would like to continue just from the short snap of my brief. I would like to outline two things that I will share with us was on the youth engagement in economic empowerment and also youth engagement in decision-making spaces. So I would like to raise some stats, just a little bit of information about the youth engagement or the youth challenge in economic sector. Solomon Island, as if you read our policy, employment is one of the most challenged identified young people, identified by youth across Solomon Island. And we have a limited opportunity within the government sector and also private sector, making it really difficult for the rapid increase of labor, young labor force to engage in formal and also informal employment. And also, it also put challenge on entrepreneurial side of it because they have limited access to invested funds or loan, and also the regulation in place was really making it hard for young people to access opportunity to start their own business or to be self-employed. According to the ILO report reveals that 2 of every 10 young people in Solomon Island were gainfully employed in these 2 sectors, government and also private sector. And also, just to highlight some stats, that in 2015, it was estimated that an unemployment rate between young people from the age of 15 to 19, it's around 70% of that previous stats that I've been raised. So between 16,000 to 18,000 youths enter into job market every year or each year, and in that number, you will only find limited % of young people engaged in these 2 sectors that I've already mentioned, private and also government sector. And I'd like to highlight a report from our central bank that also highlight in the period of 2016 to 2017, there are 4,000 jobs annually being provided for young people, and only 20% of the previous stats that I have raised were engaged in those job market each year. So it's quite a challenging environment for us young people, Solomon Island. And I want to I want to just raise some of the component that I believe young people been engaged in terms of economic empowerment. So here are some of the components of our GDP. When you look at those components, I will give you the information, like 44% of the GDP growth were from this sector: wholesale, retail, forestry, fishing, manufacturing, transport, and real estate. 21% of the component contribute to our GDP was from communication, mining, construction, utilities, and tourism. And 20% of the GDP contribute from agriculture sector, mainly from oil palm and copper. And 15% were from government activities, public services. So when you look at the stats and giving the economic challenge that we have in terms of young youth engagement in those stats, the component, you will see most of our young people were engaged in the 44% component of our GDP: retail, wholesale, fisheries, manufacturing, transportation, and also most young people participate that the 44% component contribute to the GDP, and some of them participate in 21%, the component that I raised, 21% of the GDP growth. So when you look at these 2 stats, these are the two components that really engage young people in terms of economic participation. And I will come to that point where the question around how this unemployment put challenge on those components and giving our government engage in this public state of emergency. And I will continue on to share some of the challenge in this engagement through my presentation on political participation. So as you look at those stats, it helps us to really see the challenge that our young people faced in terms of engage for a better livelihood. Because the fact is, most of our young people, as have been raised, been engaged in this 44%. And I think I will go to the other point. Sorry, I will go to the other point of political participation, just to give us some information on how young people participate in politics and also governance of this country. In political participation, as we know that from the Commonwealth Youth Index in 2016, Solomon Island ranked 76 in terms of political participation. And look at when we look at the global youth index, Solomon Island also ranked at 70. So the question here was like, it's a really serious question to ask, because when you look at the way the behavior young people participating in the election process, you can see the outcome from, what would I say? You can see the outcome from a poor decision making from young people in terms of choosing the right leader to represent them at the political level. And nowadays, young people feel the consequences of them not really engage meaningfully in voting the right leaders to really engage or provide a better solution for them in terms of the policy delivery. So when you look at the stats, or when you look at the dominion of political participation in the youth development, Commonwealth Youth Development Index, it speaks alarm of, the question of, yes, young people in Solomon Island voluntarily participate in election. There is no threat of young people, to decide who they will vote for or which political party they should affiliate or vote for the leaders. But it's all about how the state really serious about civic engagement or civic education for our young people. Because the challenge in Solomon Island, 80% of our people in this, in our country, live in rural communities. And 80%, around 70%, I would say, didn't understand the system that operates or governs them. So it leaves them in a vulnerable situation where they can manipulate by political leaders for their political interest. So you will see, even though the ranks that Commonwealth also share with us, it doesn't really reflect the sound or informed decision that young people make in terms of choosing the right leader. So for us in Solomon Island, youth activism or youth engagement was one of a culture that we wants to continue bring to young people, or wants to get young people engaged in those kind of culture. Because Solomon Island, you can understand, it's a big man system kind of culture. So we tend to respect senior, we tend to, look at this hierarchy thing and this bureaucratic thing as a respectable way of approach. But given the COVID situation, it really gives us young people to reflect, to really ask us this question: are we participate effectively with our political engagement or with the governance of this country? Because from my observation, most of our young people, we participate in this election just to vote people, but we need to think seriously about, after 4 years, what would be the policy outcome of such a government of the day. That's the important thing we need to ask as young people. So when you look at economic participation and political participation in Solomon Island, it's a serious challenge given the height of COVID. And I want to conclude with with few of my observation from this current situation, like the current situation of COVID in Solomon Island, it really pose, what would I say? It really pose a challenge that you can see lack of or disengagement of young people across all aspects of life. What I mean was most of the decision being made by government of the day, it should be a two-way kind of consultation and dialogue. But given the announcement of the state of emergency, all the decisions and the engagement were just one-way road from the government, and it tells do this and do that. And so from my observation was, given the situation, the COVID situation, it really disengaged young people across all aspects of life. And the other one was, we have an economic stimulus package that provided for people to engage in economic activity. But I believe this package was not really engaging young people that participate in informal sector. It doesn't really engage young people in this informal sector. And the other thing I want to raise that really give challenge to the COVID situation was the announcement from our public sector that they freeze job recruitment in the public sector, which it gives a lot of pressure and also challenge to young graduates from our country that coming back to our country and expect to find job. But few months ago, our public commissioner, so the Public Service Commission, announced that they will freeze the job recruitment. So it's really affected young people across Solomon Island, especially the young graduate. And the last one I want to raise was, given the situation of the COVID, politics of fear was one thing I see it's been cultivating. It gives people in Solomon Island, if people try to ask government some hard question, they will respond and say, prove that in court. So for a poor guy living in a rural community, try to ask serious question in terms of trying to understand the service provided for them, they will ask, prove yourself what you've said. And when you look at our jurisdiction, our justice system, it's an expensive exercise, our justice system. So when you look at a poor fellow trying to ask government hard question, and they say, prove us in court, it gives a political fear that they might, get some threats or stuff. So it's really a challenging thing, in giving that most of our young people been left out from the job market. We expect something that might arise if elders or leaders use the vulnerability of our young people to trigger some political disturbance. I mean, that's all from me. I can answer any question if anyone wants to more elaborate on some of the points.
Thanks so much for that presentation there, Harry. That was really devastating to see the rise in youth unemployment in the Solomon Islands, and it definitely makes sense that would, result in a disconnect from youth engagement in political processes when facing this. It was also, I found really interesting to hear the impacts of culture on youth engagement with political processes again. You mentioned that 80% of the population in the Solomon Islands live rurally, which I think will be a really great link into our next speaker, Derm, as he is joining us as our final speaker today, representing the Youth Affairs Council in Victoria. Derm is the rural manager of the organisation, so he's joined by his colleagues Albert and Reese. So they will go ahead with their presentation now. And we've had a few technical issues, so I'll just share the PowerPoint presentation for you, Dermot and colleagues.
Great. Thank you. And thanks very much to the Commonwealth Parliamentary Association for inviting us along today, and happy International Women's Day. I'm just going to, there we go. Sorry about that. Hopefully you can hear me clearly. I've got birds and rain happening in the background, so I'm hoping that the headphones might minimize that, but I don't intend to take the whole time, as I'd like to share the presentation today with Reese and Albert. So I work for Youth Affairs Council, which is the peak body for the youth sector here in Victoria, and we're also the leading advocate for young people across Victoria. I'd like to move to the next slide, and what I'd like to do is to acknowledge and pay my respects to the traditional owners of the land that we're on, the Wurundjeri people, and I'm on the lands of the Kulin Nation. I pay my respects to elders past and present, and welcome any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are joining us today, especially any young people. Acknowledgement of country is a sign of respect paid to Indigenous Australians for their ongoing custodianship of the land. These images include, on the left, the Aboriginal flag, and on the right, the Torres Strait Islander flag. In the centre is Bunjil. Bunjil's an important part of Victorian Aboriginal culture and history. Bunjil had 2 laws for people to observe when they were visiting other clans across Victoria, and they were that there was always respect paid to the land when you're on it, and to look after the children. And this reminds non-Aboriginal people like myself that First Nations community have been looking after and keeping young people safe, teaching them and making sure that they're a part of the community long before white colonisation. I also want to point out that whilst young people make up roughly about 25% of the population across Australia, in the 12 to 25 category here in Victoria, that equals 1,176,000 people, but only 2.8% of our population are Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander. However, when we look at that specific community of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander young people, they make up 53% of their whole community. So it's really important that we ensure that our programs have their voices heard in them, that we're addressing their needs, their desires, and their dreams. We might move to the next slide. As I said, my name's Derm Ryan. I'll be supported by Albert and Reese today in making this presentation to you. I just wanted to give you a broad overview of Youthquakes. So Youthquakes, we strive to ensure that our organisation's vision is brought into the reality, and that means including all young people in aspects of our work. Young people are on our board of governors. They make up over 60% of our current paid workforce. Young people are active within our membership and our agency, and they co-lead and co-design all of our major projects that we develop. Young people co-facilitate the majority of our training and consultation work, which we're going to go into a little bit of today. All of our major regional and rural projects include young people in our working groups. And across regional and rural Victoria, young people 12 to 25 make up 22% of the population. So they're a really, really important part of the structure of our work as a statewide organisation. We ensure that we design and facilitate place-based collaborative efforts across regional Victoria that link into key policy and advocacy-based projects for the whole of the organisation, but also address specific needs. In regards to COVID, and before I introduce Albert and Reese, I just wanted to give you a little bit of an idea of how it's impacted Victoria. When COVID hit, young people were amongst the most heavily impacted. Youth unemployment jumped from 16.2%, where the general population, it was trending at about 7.1%. This is partly because young people comprise more than half of the employees in industries that have been most heavily impacted by the pandemic here in Australia. This includes hospitality, retail, tourism, and the arts. Young people are also more than twice as likely to have lost their job when compared to all the other age groups. This is also because they were far more likely to be casually employed. In Victoria, the government created a program during the pandemic called the Working for Victoria Fund. Youthquakes put in a submission to the Working for Victoria Fund, which was designed around creating short-term projects during COVID that would allow Victorians to be employed. The project we put in for employed over 50 people, and this included over 20 young people employed at Youthquakes as peer facilitators. They include Reese and Albert, who are going to take over from here.
Thank you, Derm. My name is Albert Julia, and I am a young peer facilitator at Youthquakes. If I could please have the next slide. Thank you. During 2020, the Youthquakes policy team produced a policy synthesis report, the report collating over 800 findings and recommendations from over 130 publications relevant to young people in Victoria. The report found the voices of rural and regional young people and disabled young people are largely sidelined. Very few reports specifically engaged young people in regional and rural areas on state government issues, although they are usually well consulted for place-based policies and programs. This finding was supported by young people who were consulted for the development of a Victorian statewide youth strategy, which highlighted these general barriers for them. Youthquakes supports strategies to ensure that young people from regional and rural areas are consulted specifically to identify their collective recommendations and ideas for improving regional and rural Victoria across a wide range of issues and topics. Today, we want to spend this time highlighting a few specific issues and outline how young people are actively contributing in their response. Active youth participation is a prominent feature of this work. As time is short, in this session we will focus on specific barriers and issues, including mental health and disasters, both natural and man-made. And next slide, please. So our process for mental health. During 2019, a major consultation on mental health was undertaken as part of the submission to the Victorian Royal Commission into the mental health system. After the announcement, we established a working group of 18 young people to co-design our consultation project. After surveying the sector, it became apparent few people were focused on regional and rural young people. So that is where we focused our energy. The working group we actively involved in the design of activities, young people co-facilitated all focus groups and co-edited the final submission. The full submission, Beyond Access, focused on not just the experiences as problems and barriers for regional and rural communities, but also the proposed solutions for a better, more equitable system. The report was released in August of 2019. Next slide, please. For the outcomes of this report, we continue to advocate with government and the youth and community sector on key recommendations. We established a community of practice, which bring together workers and young people to advance the recommendations of this report and showcase innovation in youth mental health. Young people hosted a roundtable with the members of the Royal Commission. In 2020, the government funded a new project with a steering group of young people developing the Say It Loud in Your Crowd resource, and a series of events soon to be hosted across rural Victoria, highlighting key issues for young people related to mental health. This work was supported by the entire Youthquakes team. Last week, the Royal Commission handed down its final report to Victorian Government, and a number of key issues raised in our advocacy submission were included in the proposed redesign model for mental health. I'll now pass over to Reese. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks, Albert. Hi, everyone. My name is Reese, and I'm a young peer facilitator, and I'm calling in from Wurundjeri Wurrung country today. So this slide shows you a visual representation of the diversity of work undertaken following the bushfires last summer. And these bushfires impacted mostly Eastern Victoria and parts of New South Wales. So immediately following the Black Summer fires, Youthquakes developed disaster protocols in consultation with a wide range of stakeholders, including young people and workers from impacted areas, and also those who lived through the worst first ever experience in Victoria since 2009, where over 200 lives were lost. The protocols call for young people to be at the centre of the recovery response, to have a role in decision-making processes at a local, state and national level, for generalist and specialist youth workers to be employed and made available in affected areas, and recovery and rebuilding-based projects to be developed with and by young people. So I guess on this slide more specifically, it shows two stakeholders we engage with, one being bushfire recovery and the Department of Education and Training, where we provided training to community groups, to young people, as well as to teachers and students around how they think recovery looks and how to also implement and advocate for the recovery they want as well. And this is also an ongoing project still. Part of this was our Activators project this year or last year, which capitalized on advocacy-based responses following the fires, including responding to environment and animal welfare, which was sponsored by the RSPCA. Whilst our bushfire recovery project has many components outlined in the slide, again, it featured a youth-led working group focusing on training, upskilling, and providing advocacy by understanding young people's direct and indirect experience of the disaster. We find that young people are critical to the delivery of all components, and this response provided training to a range of government and non-government agencies, as well as the development of resources for young people and for communities. Our consultation reports produced emerging themes, which are available on our website shortly after we finish each round of work. The thinking here for, providing ongoing reports instead of a final report is to not have communities wait 12 to 18 months for the final report, but provide them access to findings as we get them. In addition to this, we also undertook a consultation for the Inspector General of Emergency Management on young people's experiences of the fires and their involvement in recovery-based activities. Our recommendations from this were focused on building resilience-based activities that better involve and include young people in recovery-based responses focused on education, mental health, communication, and community decision-making. Can I have the next slide, please? So Australia is often a harsh environment, and communities were already struggling with 5 years of drought when the fire hit. And then, of course, shortly after this and before recovery was able to commence, Victoria went into a series of lockdowns, including one for 5 months from March to August. And then 2 shorter lockdowns have limited our movement since due to COVID. Of course, during COVID, many young people were heavily impacted by the lockdown, which limited people's movements often to 5 kilometres or less, kept people at home in a curfew between 11 p.m. and 5 a.m. and moved all education and health services mostly online. This heavily impacted many young people's mental health and restricted their access to support networks. For rural young people, this was doubly challenging as the new online education platform didn't work for everybody and highlighted the holes in our national internet coverage and telephone systems, which prevented some young people from any real connection to education for months. Youthquakes surveyed young people and youth workers and developed a report advising government on key strategies needed to help people post-COVID and into recovery. Awesome. I'll hand back to Albert, who will finish off.
Thank you, Reese. Am I able to please have the next slide? Thank you. So a safe climate is continually raised for and by young people in consultations and focus groups. Young people today are justifiably fearful for the future. They are likely to be the first generation who are worse off than their parents. They face great uncertainty in terms of employment and housing security, growing income inequality, and they are deeply concerned about the existential threat of climate change. The devastating changes of climate change will severely impair the lives and prosperity of today's young people and will occur during their lifetime. If human activity and emissions continue at the current rate, temperatures in Australia are expected to rise to dangerous levels as early as 2030. Without action to prevent the climate crisis, a young person who is 12 years old today will be only 24 years old when the overwhelming impact of these changes becomes a reality. Young people will experience worse mental health as a direct result of the climate crisis, and this will more severely affect marginalised young people. There is a direct association between temperature increases and suicide rates in Australia, and evidence indicates that young people are experiencing increased anxiety and stress due to uncertainty about the future of the planet. Young people have the most to lose if real action is not taken to prevent the worst effects of climate crisis. Youthquakes is a non-partisan organisation that supports the Australian Youth Climate Coalition and the School Strike for Climate, and we share their vision for a just and sustainable world with a safe climate for this generation and future generations. Youthquakes also supports the demands of the School Strike for Climate for Australian leaders to prevent new coal, oil and gas projects, transition to renewable energy by 2030, and fund a transition and job creation program for all fossil fuel workers and communities. None of our work is worth pursuing if we don't address the issue of a changing climate. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Jim, Albert and Reese. It was great to hear your presentation. It was really, really fascinating. I found it really interesting to look at the statistics of Aboriginal youth in particular, and clear to see, it's obviously a large aspect that plays into one of the reasons that we see Indigenous populations facing such marginalised issues. And it was great as well to again see reference to bushfires, again, quite a unique issue to Australia and rural youth. So, really great to get some insight on that as well. So what we'll do next is we'll open up the session for our Q&A session. If any of our attendees have any questions at all, what we'll get you to do is just raise your hand using the raise hand button and that feature in Zoom, and then we'll allow you to talk and you can direct your question at all panelists, or if you have a specific one who you would like to answer, feel free to mention that as well. Let's see if we're getting any questions coming through. Not at this stage, so that's no problem. We've actually got some questions who have been sent in to us already. So I'll just begin with those beginning ones. I'll open this up to all of our panelists, beginning with Elizabeth Kite first. What can parliaments do to engage more with young people, both at a constituency level and a society level?
I'll go first. Yeah.
Go ahead.
Okay, sorry, you cut off for a little bit there. Personally, I think it is best that this is quite difficult because I think it's a responsibility of, a lot of people, including the Ministry of Education. But what we appreciate our parliament here in Tonga doing is educating our younger constituents in the processes and procedures of parliament. We've done this as well as an NGO, and this is something that we hope more people will be encouraging with, is actually educating our younger people on what actually takes place in Parliament. You'd be shocked how unaware a lot of people are. Even when we visit schools, we have teachers sitting in some of our sessions and learning about what a Parliament actually does. So it starts with just education. And I guess the Parliament can take a role in that, because I do know, well, at least for our Parliament, they do have an outreach section to ensure that all their constituents are receiving all the information they need on, policies and laws that they're looking to amend and things like that. So yeah, the best way is to really just start educating our people firstly on what the processes and procedures and just what the very basics of Parliament is. NGOs can really step up in that role as well, and the education system too. It's quite ridiculous. A lot of hours here in the Pacific don't actually teach our young people what governs them every day. And I just hope to see more people actually just kind of step up. And that's what we've done at myself with not only the Commonwealth Youth Council, but I run an NGO here as well called Take the Lead. And we've really taken the lead in educating our young people with the formation of a youth vote handbook, for an example, that we launched last year. And shockingly, that was the first resource ever produced for young people in Tonga to learn how to vote. Very basic stuff. So yeah, education and awareness.
Awesome. Thanks so much for that, Elizabeth. Harry, I'll also open that question up to you if you'd like to answer that one next.
Thank you. I would like to answer by saying that, like, we Solomon Island, our national parliament have a civic department that they go around and talk about the Westminster system and the governance system that governs this country. But I understand they have limited budget, because they're situated in the parliament, in the parliament house. So I don't know why they continue to have limited budget, but that civic education is important for our young people and also a citizen. And the other thing I understand, and it's a normal traditional way of engaging young people, was our ministerial policy review. They usually engage young people. But what I want to see was the adequate resources provided for this civic department in the national parliament, and also encouraging youth wing, the youth arm of the political party. Like in Solomon Island, one of our political party, Solomon Island United Party, have established a youth wing. Something that I see, it's a new nature for Pacific region, getting young people close to leaders, having meaningful conversation with leaders, because I believe that when young people participated the ministerial policy review, I feel it's just one of their contribution. But I feel that young people need to be part of the political parties so that they can, have this conversation with political leaders, learn from them, and when it comes time for them to take the lead, they can really appreciate, and also they feel part of a mentoring journey with the political leaders in our country. So what I see was to increase, if our parliament have civic department, increase resources. In Pacific, if young people wants to be part of a political party, establish a youth wing so that young people engage in those parliamentary process and procedures. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your answer, Harry. And then we'll open that up to Derm, Albert, and Reese to answer as well.
I'm happy to let Albert and Reese take the lead.
I think in terms of, could you just quickly repeat the question, Acacia?
Not a problem. So the question was, what can parliaments do to engage more with young people, both at a constituency level and at a society level?
Well, I think this is a discussion that governments have all the time in Australia, whether that be at a local, state or national level. And I think the really important part is to understand that there is a conventional way of doing politics in Australia, and I would assume in other countries, and that conventional way is not always appealing or accessible for young people. You know, lots of political conversations will happen between 9 and 5, and any young people in that 12 to 18-year-old bracket, well, they're at school, and then they have, you know, casual work afterward, and they won't be able to actually be actively involved in the process of any decision making or consultation if they need it. I do think in Victoria anyway, you know, the things we've highlighted, they're all about connecting young people with government, and whether that is local government or the state government. And so I think, you know, while it's really helpful that we have, you know, YACFIC as a bridge, it's also really important for kind of governments to change their thinking on what is the correct or conventional way of doing politics to engage young people.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that, Reese. Albert, did you also want to make any comments on that one?
Yeah, so I think to add to that, I think it is also very important to involve young people in the decision-making process. So to engage young people at every step of the process and not simply at a consultation process. And to ensure that, that we must position young people's needs and voices at the center of relevant decision-making and policy-making. To value their unique perspective and acknowledge that young people are experts in their own lives.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Albert. So we also have a question from Dylan Carver in the Q&A. He's asked, what do you think can be done to establish more meaningful engagement with young people as opposed to the more tokenistic ways, which unfortunately tends to be the case? So again, I'll open that up to all panelists, beginning with Elizabeth.
Thank you. I'm just writing down the question so I don't go away from it.
No problem. I can always repeat that again if you need.
Okay.
Just let me know.
Cool. So I actually just kind of want to go off what Albert was saying in terms of it is really important that young people have their voices heard by our leaders, but also it is a responsibility of young people as well to remember that you need to understand the processes. And there's reason for it because these processes work for these countries. And it's very unlikely that these processes will change just because you're yelling, you know? So I think that's also important that young people understand that there's a responsibility for you as well to learn about the processes and systems in place for you to have your voice heard and you can kind of navigate your way through that. But Dylan, Gava, thank you for your question. What can be done to be more meaningful with engaging youth in Parliament? Is it policy making? Okay, sure, sorry.
So no worries, I'll just repeat that for you. So it was, what do you think can be done to establish more meaningful engagement with young people as opposed to the more tokenistic ways, which unfortunately tends to be the case?
Yes. Yeah, I'm going to go back to what I was saying before about civic education is really important. I say this because this is from my own experience. You can have young people in rooms, I've been there as well, without them actually understanding what's going on. So it's really important that you educate them first on what's being said, what these procedures are, how to actually have their voices heard effectively, instead of just kind of voicing themselves ineffectively. And the other thing is as well, yes, youth are often looked at to be kind of the to kind of bring in hope to a lot of these dialogues that are quite dreary, like climate change. We rely heavily on our youth activists to come through and shine a light and be all hopeful that, Pacific can never drown and things like that, which is dangerous, that people have this kind of opinion on young people already. So that expectation, when young people come through, they feel like they kind of have to live up to it to be able to be heard. So I guess that's a really layered question, but I think, yeah, I'm going to stick to going back to educating our younger people on how to really understand the issues it is that we face, so that when you're given the opportunity and the chance to actually come in and vocalize your thoughts or opinions, it can be done so in a way that's respectful to the system, which actually already works. That's not to say that these systems should be changed. They should sometimes. But it's also to be effective in having your voices heard by these leaders. Yeah, I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, no,
it's really getting young people to really understand what the problem is, so that when they're given the opportunity, they're actually able to argue effectively, instead of just continuing to kind of just yell about their issues and hope to be heard. It doesn't always work. I know that's very different though, because I know in Australia that kind of technique works. I've lived there for some time, but I've also lived in Tonga, where if you yell here, our leaders will really just shun you, and it's not effective, whereas it does kind of work in Australia. So I'm specifically talking to the Pacific Islander young leaders. It's important that you know how to navigate through our systems that are in place, because also keep in mind we have our different values, which is, you know, respect for our elders, which we prioritize, and so that's the only effective way to communicate with us. So yes, educate our young people.
Thanks so much, Elizabeth. So I'll now open up for Harry to answer that question as well.
Thank you for that question. Yeah, in the context of Pacific, I would say that in order for leaders not to, tokenism of young people's participation was to establish a policy that have these 4 pillars, like enable young people to understand the system that Elizabeth already alluded, and enable young people to understand this, the system that govern them, and also ensure that they really understand and engage, and also empower them to really see the importance of why they should engage in and really hold government accountable, or market solution to government deliveries of their policies, and also around engaging. So for me, what I see was like, if you're looking at developing an act in Parliament that would be strong for Pacific leaders, you have to create legal instrument that you can hold them accountable. If you don't create legal instrument, it would be a hard ad hoc, or verbal, they can say commitment. But if you use those legal instruments to hold them accountable, they will always respect and engage and find a better solution for your engagement. But if you don't have a legal instrument or policies or act that really tells them that you commit to this, but you haven't really engaged us to really deliver what you're committed to, that would be for us. I understand, Elizabeth would understand as well. That would be a tokenism. If you don't have a policy or legal framework that guides your engagement, then I would say in Pacific region, like for us, male nation it's a big man system. It's a seniority type of thing. We respect leaders. But if you have this legal instrument, they will come down and really discuss with you, because they put commitment. They put some commitment, a legal commitment. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Harry, for your answer to that. Next, I'd like to open up the question to Letu. I'm sure some of your experience from the CPA's Virtual Youth Parliament are definitely relevant on this question. So Letu, if you would like to provide your answer next.
Thank you very much. I'm just going to add on to what Elizabeth has said, since we're both here from Tonga. And to be honest, she has mentioned how it's really poor and it's really alarming how the youths of Tonga are not aware of their political processes, or even when you ask them what is the age to vote, they do not know, which is, yeah, it's really daunting. But just like what Elizabeth have said, it all comes down for people that are keen to educate our youths. And I feel like that here in Tonga, since I have mentioned before, since COVID-19 has happened and all these decision makings that are going on, the ministries and the government that are making decisions for what to do during this pandemic, I think and I feel that the youth are realizing that the civil right is very important in choosing their leaders. So I really feel like, and honestly, it just has to come down to educating. And I'll just say this, I'm not going to hold back, but I think it is also the responsibility of a youth to educate themselves. You don't have to wait for someone to tell you that this is how you look for information, this is where you gather information. Please take the initiative and try to learn it by yourself. So yeah, that's it from me.
Thank you so much for your answer to that one, Latu. Just in regards to time, we're just going to move on to the next question now, and we'll go to Derm and Albert and Reese for this one again. The next question we have is, what can young parliamentarians who've been elected to office in democratic institutions do to further their engagement and represent youth? And I will hand over to Derm, Albert and Reese to answer that one now.
While Albert and Reese are thinking about how they'd like to respond, I think that there's a really good opportunity there for those elected representatives, young parliamentarians, to understand that whilst they may have specific views, they're there to represent everybody as a constituent. And those opportunities to engage with people who think differently than themselves and might have a different view to the one that they are representing. It's really important that they find ways to actively connect with those young people and bring those young people together so that we can share the different understandings that we all have if we're going to be allowed to or able to move forward in a more peaceful way. And I might get Albert and Reese to jump in because I've given them a minute there to think before they respond.
Well, I mean, I think I largely agree with Derm, and I think, I think this question kind of leads into the things that Elizabeth has brought up in terms of the need to educate. And, if you are a young person who is elected or representing young people or just a constituency in general, then it is, that burden to be able to communicate with your constituents is there. And I think as a young person who, works in politics or is involved in politics, you then need to be able to educate other young people on the political process. From my understanding, it is also an issue in Australia in terms of lots of young people, particularly in their early to mid-teens, not understanding how our machinery of government works. But if you're elected, then that's a prime opportunity. And I also think it's being able to speak with other people who have perhaps opposing views, and then also sometimes understanding the core root of an issue. Sometimes the cause of an issue looks very simple, but it can actually be, incredibly complex. You can think of young people not understanding the civic process as much, or not being involved as a citizen, and that could be linked to higher education and decreases in funding for political science degrees. It could be also linked to, a broken system. And I understand that sometimes systems really do work, but, usually they work for, the people who are older and in charge, not necessarily young people.
Thanks so much for that, Reese. And then we'll hand over to Albert if he's got any other final comments to add on to that as well.
Thanks. I definitely agree with both Derm and Reese on this. And I also think that young parliamentarians should encourage young people to engage in the political process, and that to use their own personal experience to help engage young people and see how it is best that young people can engage in that process and what maybe the access barriers they faced were in engaging in the political process and how to overcome them. And I also think that young parliamentarians can really help to push to implement a genuine youth participation strategy in government also.
Can I add? Can I say something?
Go for it, Harry.
In the Pacific region, I would say from my experience, young leaders when they go into political space, they need to have that same passion that they go in with. For Solomon Island, we have like the youngest were around 29 when he was elected, but when he's getting to parliament, he's off to different engagement and influence. But what I want to raise here was the current, the other current young leader that now our current parliament member was the son of our first founding prime minister, and he had the passion in continue engage in youth space, and that is where he talked about establishing the youth wing within the political party, and he was the political party wing leader. So he talked with the executive. We need to establish a youth wing so that we continue to engage young people. And if there is a parliament session, he will call us young people. What do you want me to say in parliament? So we write something to him, and we send something to him, and he continue talked about whatever we present to him in the parliament. So I see that sometimes it's more on passion, because sometimes if you get into this space and you have different influence from old and experienced parliamentarians, they will lead you to a direction that you need to remember where you first started as a youth worker, as a young leader, and as a young people that engage with community activities. Yeah.
Thanks so much for your answer as well, Harry. And we'll just give our final answer for this question to Elizabeth.
Thank you. Yeah, I agree with what everyone has said so far. It is a great responsibility of young parliamentarians to actually ensure that their constituent and their people that they represent voices are being heard. And that's a really big responsibility, but that is the responsibility of every parliamentarian anyway. I would like to actually example Tonga's youngest parliamentarian, who I think does an excellent job in actually ensuring and pushing for further youth engagement and having their voices heard. And he's actually the Speaker of our Parliament. I think he was at one point the youngest Speaker of Parliament worldwide. And ever since, he's been really active in ensuring that young people have their voices heard. We saw under him the first in 10 years youth parliament in Tonga. And while that's a mock parliament, this is part of the education that I was talking about previously that helps young people understand the processes. So by the time they're able to really be in there, they're able to actually deliver effectively. So yeah, basically what everyone else said, but also yes, for the parliamentarians I liked what I think it was Albert that said, a strategy to have something formalized to ensure that young people's voices will be heard, or Harry, maybe you said that. Yes, so I'll keep my answer short because I know we're pressed for time. So thank you.
Awesome. Thanks so much for that, Elizabeth. So that will conclude our Q&A session, just in the interest of time there. Thank you all for three very different presentations that's given great insight around the Pacific into the challenges that youth face, and particularly with youth choosing to engage with parliaments and parliamentary procedure. So I would just like to open up for closing remarks from Dim, Harry, and then Elizabeth. So Dim, if you would like to begin with those closing remarks and any final comments that you have.
My closing remarks are going to be to hand over to people that are younger than myself to make closing remarks, because I think it's about living those values and giving them the space to do that. So over to them. Thank you for having me.
All right. Yeah, to Albert and Reese, go ahead.
Well, I mean, I think it's fantastic that we all had this space today. You know, I never really understood the context of, you know, government just in general in the Pacific Islands. And that's the fantastic thing for me to learn about today. And I will definitely continue, you know, to do my own learning in my own time. It's great to see that young people are engaged in, you know, advocacy and activism worldwide. And, you know, I hope to see it more, and perhaps, you know, some more transnational activism now that we're, you know, slowly moving out of the pandemic as well.
Thanks, Reese. I just also wanted to echo what Reese said and thank you for this opportunity. And also just to highlight again that young people, we must position their needs and voices at the center of relevant policy and decision making. Thank you.
Thank you. And next, we'll go to Harry for his closing remarks.
Thank you for the great opportunity. I think my closing remark was on how can we engage, how can we have this best practice from North and South to really engage different modalities of engagement. Because like we discussed about, you know, different best practices, but in the Pacific region, give an example, Australia and New Zealand were just next to us, but we see best practices by young people. Youth champion from Australia, they deliver those best practices in Africa, in Europe, but we were just next to them. How can this best practice come to Pacific region? I see this example because when we're part of this platform, it's about Commonwealth, a common value and common vision. But we always look to Australia and New Zealand in terms of innovative ideas, new ways of doing things. But we want to feel that young people from these two countries that really engage in terms of our political engagement at the regional level. But we want to see a really engagement at the youth level from these two countries with our Pacific young people, so that they bring the best practices in Australia and New Zealand to our young people in the Pacific region. Because every time we look at the newsletter, we look at the magazines, they, you know, make really change better lives in regions that really far from young people. And you will see that our government talked about peace and security, but then you look at the Pacific region, we have a youth bulge. So how can we young people start to have the conversation for us to really support our government in terms of driving our youth agenda forward? Thank you.
Thank you so much for those closing remarks, Harry. And finally, to our last panelist for her closing remarks, over to you, Elizabeth.
Thank you. I'll keep it short, but I think what I'd like to say is that for our young leaders, parliaments know their mandate. Let them do their thing. We can, you know, encourage them as much as we want, but I think we should just really focus on what we can do for ourselves. We can go educate ourselves. We can go learn for ourselves. And also know that it is your right to actually speak to every leader, no matter who it is, even if it's the Prime Minister. They work for you. That's their job. It's not the other way around. So if you need to go and knock on their door to talk to them, go do that, because you have every right to. And I really encourage every young person to do that. I've had to do it myself. I've had multiple ministers that didn't want to have conversations with me, but I stood there until they finally were like, fine, let's talk. So, you know, really take the initiative to go out there and have your voice heard if you know, you feel that it doesn't want to be heard. But you'd be shocked with how many of these leaders in place are actually really willing to. Even if it's not genuine, they also have a mandate to have youth voices heard within, you know, their ministries. So go do that. Yes, I'll leave it at that. Go educate yourselves and go speak to your ministers, knock on every door that you need to. And yes, I love it though.
Thanks so much, Elizabeth. And just on behalf of the CPA Secretariat, I just want to say a big thank you to Elizabeth, Derm, Albert and Reese, of course, Harry and Latu for all joining us today. And that brings today's workshop to a close. Thanks for everyone for attending as well.